My name is Robert Mitchell. I am 63 years old, and I spent the last 4 decades of my life building something I thought would be eternal. I am not talking just about my construction business, but about the family I created, the home I built brick by brick, the legacy I imagined leaving. Today, sitting in this quiet office in Boulder, Colorado, looking at the Rocky Mountains through the window while the afternoon sun paints the sky orange and purple, I realize that the most important foundations are made of truth and integrity. And when those foundations rot from the inside, the whole structure is doomed to collapse. I met Margaret in 1982 at a Thanksgiving party in Denver. She was 22 years old, worked as an executive secretary, and when she smiled at me for the first time, I felt as if someone had turned on all the lights in a building that was in the dark. I was 24, still smelled like sawdust and paint most of the time, drove a Ford pickup that made noise above 50 miles per hour. But I had ambition enough for 10 men and a 5-year plan scribbled in a notebook. We married 6 months later in a small Methodist church in Aurora. Our honeymoon was a weekend in Estes Park because it was all we could afford, but we hiked the trails of Rocky Mountain National Park planning our future. Margaret got pregnant 3 months after the wedding, and when I held our daughter Jennifer for the first time at Presbyterian Hospital in Denver, I promised myself that I would do anything to give her and Margaret a better life than I had. And I kept that promise. In the first 5 years, I worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. I started at 5 in the morning, spent the afternoons installing drywall, and ended the nights doing estimates at our tiny kitchen table. My company, Mitchell Construction, started with bathroom renovations, but in 1990, we were already building custom homes. In 1995, I got my first commercial contract, an office complex that earned me $270,000 in profit. Margaret stopped working when Jennifer was born and never went back. Jennifer had piano lessons, swimming, and Margaret took her to all of them, organized birthday parties, coordinated play dates with other mothers in the neighborhood. We bought our first real house in 1993, a 3-bedroom ranch in Littleton. It cost $185,000. Jennifer grew up too fast, as all parents say, but it is true. One moment, she was learning to tie her shoes. The next, she was asking to borrow the car keys to go to Park Meadows Mall with friends. She was smart, got high grades without much apparent effort, had dozens of friends, was captain of the school volleyball team. Margaret and I sat in the bleachers of the Cherry Creek High School gym screaming her name while she blocked and spiked, her blonde hair tied in a ponytail swinging with every explosive and precise movement. After the games, the 3 of us went to Denny's on Colorado Boulevard, ordered pancakes with maple syrup and creamy milkshakes, and Jennifer told us about her plans for college, how she wanted to study business administration at the University of Colorado Boulder. Maybe even work with me someday and turn Mitchell Construction into a real family business that would pass to future generations. That was the plan. That was the narrative that we all bought and sold to each other for years, repeating at Christmas dinners and summer barbecues, reinforcing with every family photo and every celebrated milestone. Happy family, prosperous business, bright future painted in vibrant colors of traditional American success. But narratives are like facades of impressive commercial buildings. They seem solid and well-built until you knock on the walls with your knuckles and hear the hollow sound that indicates there is nothing really holding up behind, just air and carefully maintained illusions. Jennifer went to CU Boulder in 2001 at 17 years old, a partial scholarship that covered approximately 40% of expenses, and a 2000 Honda Civic I bought for her at a dealership in Centennial. She visited home every 2 weeks at the beginning, bringing bags of dirty laundry and animated stories about college life, then once a month with less enthusiasm, then only on major holidays with elaborate excuses about intense studies. Margaret said it was normal, that teenagers needed independence to become functional adults, that everything was fine and I should not worry. But I noticed small things that did not fit. I noticed that Margaret justified everything, defended everything, created elaborate explanations for questionable and suspicious behaviors. But I was too busy to investigate deeply. Mitchell Construction was at the peak of success. In 2003, it had 42 dedicated employees, a fleet of 12 commercial vehicles, an office with a receptionist and a full-time accountant. We built not just houses, but entire subdivisions, busy shopping centers, even a charter school in Broomfield that received design awards. My personal annual income exceeded $500,000 for the first time in 2005, and I started to think seriously about a quiet retirement, about selling the business eventually and traveling with Margaret to all the places we promised to go, but never had time. Jennifer graduated in 2005 without honors, but with a degree, which was all I had asked for. She got a job as a marketing assistant at a software company in Denver, earning $38,000 a year, rented a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. Margaret and I helped her with the security deposit and the first 2 months of rent, $5,200 in total. She promised she would pay us back as soon as she got settled. She never paid, but I did not mind much at the time. Parents help children. That is how it works. In 2007, Jennifer met a guy named Derek Thompson at a CrossFit gym. Derek was 29 years old, worked in sales for a medical equipment company, drove a red convertible Mustang that seemed to have been bought to impress. Margaret loved Derek immediately, said he had ambition, that he was charming, that he treated Jennifer like a princess. I had reservations. There was something in his eyes, a type of calculation, a way of evaluating things that reminded me of how city inspectors looked at construction sites looking for violations to fine. But I kept my opinions to myself because Jennifer seemed happy, and Margaret was so excited planning an eventual wedding that I did not want to throw cold water. They got engaged in 2009. Derek proposed at an expensive restaurant in Cherry Creek, a 2-carat ring that I later found out he bought on credit and was still paying for 3 years later. The wedding happened in June of 2010 at the Denver Botanic Gardens. 150 guests, live band, food served by waiters in tuxedos. Margaret insisted that our only child deserved a fairy tale wedding. The total cost was $87,000. I paid every penny without complaining because it was what parents do. It was my responsibility. And honestly, the business was doing so well that $87,000 seemed like a manageable amount. 2 years after the wedding, Jennifer and Derek bought a house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Highlands Ranch that cost $420,000. They got financing but needed help with the 20% down payment, $84,000. Derek called me personally, said it was an investment in their future, that they had plans to have children soon, that they wanted the grandchildren to have a backyard to play in and good schools in the district. Margaret was by my side when I answered the call, holding my hand, her blue eyes pleading silently. I transferred the money the following week. I bought 2 more investment properties in 2011 and 2013, both rental houses in Aurora that generated good passive income. The first cost $215,000, the second $290,000. Margaret said it was smart to diversify, that rental properties would be our security in retirement. She took over managing them, handled tenants, repairs, rent collection. Honestly, I was happy to delegate because work was increasingly stressful, building codes more complicated, profit margins tighter, competition more aggressive. In 2015, I sold Mitchell Construction for $2,200,000 to a larger corporation that wanted to expand in the Colorado market. After taxes and paying remaining debts, I netted approximately $1,400,000. Adding our existing savings, investments, and the rental properties, Margaret and I had a total net worth of about $2,300,000. At 56 years old, I was officially retired. The first months were wonderful. Margaret and I took that trip to Europe we always talked about. 3 weeks visiting Paris, Rome, Barcelona, Prague. We bought a Class A motorhome, a new Winnebago that cost $140,000, and spent the autumn visiting national parks. I played golf. She joined a gardening club. We dined out 3 times a week, woke up late, had no commitments. It was the American dream realized. But something started to change subtly. Margaret became distant, distracted. She spent hours on the phone with Jennifer, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. She started going to the gym more, bought new clothes, changed her hair from natural blonde to platinum blonde that cost $300 a month to maintain. When I asked about these changes, she laughed, said she was just taking care of herself, that women her age deserved to feel attractive. I did not fight because it seemed selfish to question, because marriages require trust. Because after 33 years together, you assume you know a person. The bomb exploded on a Tuesday in March of 2016. I returned home after playing 18 holes at Meadows Golf Club and found Margaret in the living room with an expression I had never seen before, something between determination and contempt. She said we needed to talk, that she had not been happy for years, that she had grown and changed, that she deserved more from life than being the wife of a retired contractor in Colorado. She said she wanted a divorce. She said this calmly, practically, as if she were discussing what to make for dinner. I was in shock, literally unable to process the words for several seconds. I asked if there was someone else. She said it was not about someone else. It was about herself, her happiness, her future. I asked if we could try couples therapy. She shook her head, said she had already made her decision, that she had already consulted a lawyer. That last part hit me like a punch in the stomach. She had already consulted a lawyer. She had planned this, prepared, kept me completely in the dark while organizing my dismantling. The following weeks were surreal. Margaret moved into the guest room, treated every interaction with me with cold professional politeness. Jennifer called once to ask how I was, but the conversation was short, uncomfortable, and she was clearly on her mother's side. Margaret's lawyer, a guy named Richard Feldman with an office in Cherry Creek and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in high-net-worth divorces, sent the initial petition 2 weeks after that conversation. The terms she was seeking were shocking. Margaret wanted the main house in Littleton, valued at $550,000. She wanted the 2 rental properties in Aurora, valued at a total of $505,000, and she wanted a lump sum of $300,000 in cash. Essentially, she was asking for approximately $1,350,000 of our $2,300,000 net worth, leaving me with less than $1 million after 3 decades building everything from scratch while she stayed at home. I hired my own lawyer, Daniel Rosenberg, recommended by my accountant. Daniel was 58 years old, 40 years of experience in family law, a modest office in Englewood, and a methodical and patient approach that calmed me immediately. He reviewed Margaret's demands and shook his head slowly, said she was asking for approximately 60% of everything when Colorado was an equitable marital property state, meaning 50-50 division unless there were compelling reasons to deviate. But there was a problem. Technically, the 2 rental properties were only in Margaret's name. When we bought them, she had insisted it was simpler for management purposes to have only one name on the deeds, and I trusted her completely. She had handled all aspects of these properties for years, collected rents, paid taxes, organized repairs. I signed documents without reading completely because Margaret was my wife, my partner, the mother of my daughter. Feldman was arguing that because the properties were only in her name and she had been the only one managing them, they were her separate property, not marital. It was absurd. The down payment money had come from the sale of my company, but proving that required documentation I had not organized properly. Daniel presented a counter-proposal. I would keep the main house, 1 rental property, and pay Margaret $400,000 in cash. She would keep the second rental property. It was approximately 50-50 division considering all assets. Feldman rejected immediately, came back insisting on the original terms. The months dragged on. Depositions, document discovery, asset valuations, endless emails from lawyers charging $400 an hour to write paragraphs that could be summarized in a sentence. Margaret hired an appraiser to value the main house at only $475,000, despite comparable houses in the area selling for $550,000 or more. She hired another appraiser for the rental properties who magically found structural problems that supposedly reduced the value to only $300,000 combined. It was obvious what was happening. She was trying to inflate her share while deflating mine, but proving bad faith in court required more than intuition. It was in August of 2016, 5 months into the divorce process, that I received the call that changed everything. It was 3:15 in the morning. My phone rang on the nightstand, and when I answered half asleep, Daniel Rosenberg's voice was on the other end, tense and urgent in a way I had never heard before. He said, "Robert, I need you to listen very carefully and not react emotionally to what I'm going to tell you. Your daughter Jennifer and your wife Margaret are planning something, and you need to know before the hearing next week." I sat up in bed, completely awake now, heart racing. Daniel explained that a private investigator he had hired quietly to check some financial discrepancies in the rental records of the properties had discovered something disturbing. Margaret was not just collecting the rents from these properties. She was collecting more than she reported, pocketing the difference and using Jennifer as an intermediary. The tenants paid Jennifer. Jennifer passed part to Margaret, and both split the rest. This had been going on for over 2 years, totaling approximately $63,000 embezzled. But there was more. The investigator had managed access to Jennifer's bank records through means that Daniel described as legally defensible, but ethically questionable, and there were regular transfers from Derek to Margaret, thousands of dollars a month, dating back more than a year before she asked for the divorce. Derek had received a substantial bonus at his work in 2015, $140,000, and instead of using it to pay his and Jennifer's mortgage or save, was secretly funding Margaret. Daniel said there was strong evidence that Margaret had planned the divorce for at least 18 months, systematically hiding assets, diverting income, and preparing with Jennifer and Derek to ensure she walked away with the maximum possible while leaving me with the minimum. He said there was more. Something about recordings, but that he needed to see me in person to explain completely. I drove to his office at 5 a.m, still dark outside, empty streets, just delivery trucks and some night shift workers going home. Daniel met me at the door, took me to his conference room and placed a small digital recorder on the table between us. He said the investigator had planted recording devices in 2 places, Jennifer's house in Highlands Ranch and Margaret's car. Colorado was a one-party consent state for recordings, meaning it was legal to record conversations as long as one person in the conversation consented. The investigator had obtained consent from one of the tenants of the rental properties who was dissatisfied with how Margaret had handled a repair and suspected irregularities. Daniel pressed play. I heard Margaret's voice, unmistakable, that voice that had told me she loved me 1,000 times, that had whispered to me in the dark, that had sung to our daughter when she was a baby. She was talking to Jennifer, and they were laughing. Margaret was saying, "He has no idea. He thinks he is going to get half of everything, but after Feldman is done with him, we will be lucky if he keeps the house and some crumbs. The properties are mine, the money is ours, and he will spend the rest of his retired life wondering where it all went wrong." Jennifer replied, "Do you think he will find out about the rents?" Margaret said, "How? He never paid attention to details. He just signed what I put in front of him and went back to the golf course. Besides, even if he finds out, he cannot prove anything. Money passed through you. You will say it was payment for property management work you did for me. Completely legitimate." There was more in the recordings, hours of them, conversations between Margaret and Feldman discussing strategies to hide assets, conversations between Jennifer and Derek about how to use the money they were embezzling, even a conversation where Margaret speculated about finding a new rich husband after the divorce was over, someone with more money and less attention to details than me. Every word was like a knife, not just in the heart, but in the whole idea of who I thought these people were. Daniel explained that with these recordings we could present a case for fraud, concealment of assets, and bad faith in the divorce process. We could ask the judge to not only reject Margaret's demands, but potentially punish her by giving me a disproportionate portion of the marital assets as a sanction. He said the hearing the following week would be perfect to introduce the evidence, catch Margaret and Feldman completely by surprise. The hearing happened on a Thursday at 2 p.m. at the Denver District Court, room 113, Judge Sarah Hamilton presiding. Margaret was sitting next to Feldman at the plaintiff's table, wearing a conservative gray suit, hair pulled back in a bun, minimal makeup to look humble and mistreated. Jennifer was in the court galleries for moral support. I was with Daniel, wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue one I had bought for Jennifer's wedding 6 years earlier. Feldman presented first, making his case for why Margaret deserved the 3 properties. He painted a picture of a dedicated woman who had sacrificed her own career to support an ambitious husband, who had managed family investments with skill and care, who deserved financial security in her golden years. He presented the appraisal reports with the low values, argued that the rental properties were essentially Margaret's business and should be treated as separate property. Then Daniel had his turn. He started calmly, methodically, presenting evidence that the money for all properties had come from the sale of my company. He presented bank statements, transfer receipts, documentation I thought I had lost, but Daniel had reconstituted through subpoena requests to banks. He showed that technically placing the properties only in Margaret's name had been a decision of convenience, not an indication of separate ownership. Then he paused, looked at Judge Hamilton, and said he had evidence of bad faith by the plaintiff that was relevant to how the court should divide assets. Feldman immediately objected, said he had not been notified about such evidence, that it was an ambush attempt. Daniel calmly presented documentation showing he had sent appropriate notice within the required legal deadline. Only Feldman, apparently, had not read completely. The judge, Hamilton, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for not tolerating games or lies, ordered Daniel to proceed. He placed the small digital recorder on the evidence table and pressed play. The voices of Margaret and Jennifer filled the courtroom. He has no idea. He thinks he's going to get half of everything. I saw Margaret turn pale, then red, then pale again. Jennifer in the gallery brought her hand to her mouth. Feldman was furiously flipping through papers as if he could find some way to make this disappear. Daniel played several different sections of the recordings, each more damaging than the previous. Margaret discussing how much she was embezzling from the rental properties. Jennifer and Derek laughing about how smart they were. Margaret and Feldman discussing strategies that bordered on obstruction of justice. At the moment, Daniel stopped the recorder. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. Judge Hamilton looked at Margaret with an expression that can only be described as pure contempt. She asked Feldman if his client would like to explain those recordings. Feldman, for the first time since I met him, seemed completely disarmed. He asked for a brief recess to consult his client. Judge Hamilton denied, said she had heard enough, that she was going to make a decision now. She declared that the recordings clearly demonstrated that Margaret had engaged in systematic fraud, concealment of assets, and bad faith during the marriage and the divorce process. As a result, she was rejecting all of Margaret's petitions for the properties. She was awarding the main house and both rental properties to me. She was ordering Margaret to pay my legal fees, which totaled at that point about $78,000. And she was ordering a separate investigation into whether criminal charges should be filed for fraud and tax evasion related to the unreported rental income. Margaret collapsed, literally collapsed on the table, sobbing. Jennifer ran out of the courtroom. Feldman was mumbling something about an appeal, but even he knew there was no basis. Judge Hamilton banged the gavel, and thus ended my marriage of 34 years, not with sentimentality or reconciliation, but with cold and legally appropriate justice. The consequences were complex. Margaret moved to a small apartment in Denver that cost $1,200 a month. Jennifer and Derek separated 6 months later when it became clear that the financial and legal stress had poisoned their marriage. Derek lost his job when his employer found out about the embezzlement scheme and decided they did not want a sales representative with ethical issues. Jennifer tried to approach me a few times, tearful calls late at night asking for forgiveness, saying Mother had manipulated her, that she made a terrible mistake. I told her I needed time. Today, 3 years later, I live alone in the house in Littleton. The rental properties now have professional management, a third-party company that handles everything and charges a reasonable fee. My net worth is at approximately $2,700,000 after property appreciation and careful investments. I do not play much golf anymore. I occupy my time volunteering at Habitat for Humanity, building houses for families that need them. It is satisfying to create something tangible again, hammer nails, saw wood, see structures take shape. Margaret calls occasionally, trying reconciliation, saying she made a horrible mistake. I am always polite, but firm in refusals. Jennifer and I have lunch once a month now, slowly rebuilding something that I do not know if it can be called a father-daughter relationship, but it is at least civil communication. She works as a bartender, minimum wage plus tips, lives with 2 roommates in a small apartment. Sometimes I feel bad for her, but I remember that choices have consequences, that betrayal leaves scars that never heal completely. At night, sitting on the back deck while the sun sets over the Rocky Mountains, I think about everything I built and everything I lost. I built a construction empire from scratch. I built a home, a family, a legacy, but I discovered that the most important constructions are the invisible ones: integrity, honesty, self-respect. And when you discover that the people closest to you tried to demolish those foundations, you have a choice. You can collapse along with the structure, or you can rebuild, this time with stronger materials and deeper footings. I chose to rebuild. And despite the loneliness that sometimes floods me like a cold mountain wind, I sleep well at night, knowing that when that lawyer called at 3 a.m. saying my daughter was planning something, I listened. And when I had the opportunity to present that recording in court and watch the judge laugh at the absurdity of Margaret's demands before destroying them completely, I understood that justice, when it finally arrives, is a foundation upon which it is worth building a future.